Okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Wonderful. So, hi everyone. We're going to be talking about strategy for CP tournaments. Given that we have, what's it called? Seagrams, Leger, CP Nats, and Dorch still up on the docket for CP tournaments for this year, I figure it would be relevant to talk about some deeper strategy for this format rather than just like similar story to how we would do for BP. So, today we're going to be going over a few things. Hold on. Why am I not able to advance? There we go. We're going to be talking about a few things. One, how to avoid tight and spec calls. Two, building gov cases that are effective and able to win. Three, op strategy. And four, to conclude once again, tight and spec calls, but how to actually make them. So this is pretty easily divided up into effective things for you to be able to do when you're on gov and effective things for you to be able to do when you're on op. So before we go any further, I just want to make something clear. If at any point you have questions throughout our chat here, please simply ask them at your earliest convenience. You can throw your question in the chat, or when I am at the end of a sentence, you can simply ask me, and that will work too. I want to make sure that this is done, throughout the presentation as opposed to just all at the end. So that way I can make sure that I don't, skip over something that, people want to know more about or are still confused with. So let's begin. First, how to avoid tight and spec calls. I want to note that tight and spec calls are unquestionably the things that most debaters overfixate on and think are way more prominent of an idea than they actually are. I promise you that the overwhelming majority of instances that you are going to be in a CP round, you will never, ever, ever have to worry about a tight call. Why? Because as we're going to expand on later, tight calls are actually quite difficult to be able to maintain. But if you are concerned with this, there are a few things worth doing that can prepare you and make sure that this is now even less of a concern. The first is having a tight block prepared. A tight block is simply put a response to the question that op is putting forward, which is this case tight, right? What you are doing on proposition is preparing to explain why it is that the case is in fact not tight. A few ways you can do this is by, first of all, emphasizing what the actual burden you are taking on within the debate is. And this might be as rudimentary as saying, hey, I remember there was an instance of a case about, legalizing, like making it such that doctors are even more able to, pharmaceutical companies are even more easily able to market drugs to doctors. Some moron team decided to call that case tight. And the easiest way to be able to get around that is just emphasize, what the actual burden that you are upholding for yourself actually is. In a case about, not punishing teams who are tanking, which is deliberately building rosters that are, not going to be particularly successful in sports. What the hell? Anyway, in the chat, deliberately constructing rosters that are unlikely to be successful. You can simply emphasize the burden, which is, hi, we are saying that teams should be allowed to deliberately suck, have no interest in actually winning games, even though the players are trying hard, and do so with completely no punishment or no discouragement. Clearly, there are reasons why it is, but this may not be a particularly good idea. This is relevant because if you're able to do this reasonably effectively, it does a very high level of intuition pumping for the judge that, they shouldn't be discrediting your case just because you were good. They should instead be putting a lot more punishment to opposition because they couldn't figure out what exactly they were supposed to do. Secondly, is just noting what an argument would be that would beat your case, right? This doesn't have to be like a great argument. This doesn't have to be an argument that would be given an 85 if anyone gave it. But simply put, you can say, hey, if this team chose to talk about how it is that this is a policy that would I don't know, end up having worse effects for the economy as a whole, or make it harder for people to advance their position in the workplace, and why it is that that's a bad thing. That's a pretty valid and intuitive case for them to be able to run, that they could, in theory, weigh against our case rather substantially, right? So just have some level of preparation there, and you tend to be pretty okay. The way you want to deal with any sort of tight call is at the top of the second prop speech, you just kind of want to mention it briefly for like maybe a minute if you're pushing it, and then just kind of move on. If opposition continues to complain, then in the PMR, be a little bit more mean to them if you wish, and then just emphasize again why it is that it's not tight. Secondly, the threshold for a spec call is high, right? A lot of people worry like, oh, is this too specific knowledge? Is this like really a concern? No, it's not, right? The thresholds for spec calls that I've always understood it to be are things that you could not reasonably expect somebody in university to have known about without specialist knowledge that you uniquely have due to a characteristic that is extraordinary, right? So the distinction here would be, if you want to run a motion about, nuances in Latin American politics, that's completely fine and acceptable, even if you know that you are the only person at that tournament who knows about Latin American politics. Why? Because it's not crazy to expect that a bunch of university educated poli-sci majors know about Latin American politics, right? At all. It's completely reasonable to expect them. Now, if what you are doing is being very nitpicky and emphasizing specific nuances in laws that are very uncommonly reported about or exclusively reported about in like Spanish, let's say, that nobody would have had a reasonable opportunity to have read about, then you're starting to, wary into territory of being spec. But like, if you're simply running a case about like Eastern Europe and that a lot about the issue and they don't, like, that's just an instance of suck to suck, like sucks to suck for them, right? Literally, that is completely fine. If you are especially worried, though, there are two things worth doing. First, making the case op choice, right? Why? Because in op choice cases, there are two things that work very strongly to your advantage. The first is you can never call an op choice case tight. Anybody want to take a guess as to why? Or I think Vadeep mentioned it last time, but worth asking again. Why can't an op choice case be tight? Wherein I give you the two choices of which side you want to be on. Tyler, go for it, friend.
It's because you chose it.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I give you two options and you choose the one that is unfair for your side, that sounds like a you problem more than it is a motion problem, right? So if you're concerned with a case being like super tight, you could make it op choice if you think that the team is accidentally going to choose the side that is unfair for them. This also works for cases that have a lot more specific knowledge for them, right? Op choice cases bring with them more question time throughout the debate as well. Since you are choosing your side, it's much harder to convince a judge that with 2 to 3 minutes of asking questions plus picking the side between the two, that therefore you have been treated unfairly. Op choice is a style of case within CP debating wherein the prime minister presents the case and says, you choose between which side of the debate you want to be on. Typically, you are presenting two binary choices to the opposition team, and they are picking which one they defend, and as a result, which one you defend. So the second thing you can do is simply put, give necessary context at the top of the prime minister's speech, and don't make arguments that rely on something that isn't evidently clear or reasonably intuitive based off of that context. So if you want to run your motion about Latin American politics, it is perfectly possible for you to not run an op choice and simply spend a minute and a half in the prime minister's speech outlining relevant context that would be necessary to know for a functioning debate, and then just make arguments based off of that context that are just rather intuitive. So if you say, hey, some context, these two countries have had, major political strife between each other. This country has been doing poorly economically as of late. This country has had a descent into, proto-fascist governance. And as a result, here are our arguments that stem from these premises rather clearly. If you're not adding in a lot of extra outside information that isn't something you immediately tell them at the top of your speech, you can also respond to these types of spec calls by saying, hey, we gave them the information, right? We've both been using this exact same information throughout the debate. We just simply said, given the, information that these two countries are doing poorly economically, we said that the implication of this policy would be that it would be harder for them to improve economically. They were not able to make an argument for why this might be good economically, right? And you can make it such that you give them some of the intuition to make those arguments, but you still use that to skew to your benefit. I want to emphasize something here. I've been talking too long about tight calls and spec calls. Tight calls are more common than spec calls by a decent amount, but both are still very uncommon. They don't happen that often. These are just things to have in your back pocket should the worst thing occur, but you should not be expecting this as a commonplace within CP debates. Cool.
Can D allow tight call?
Generally speaking, no. Something drastic would have to happen for that to be the case. In general, you would want that to be one of the first things you say out of the op case. We'll talk about that bit more later, though. Cool. On building cases. Statistically speaking, Gov sucks. In general, op wins about 60% of all CP rounds. But, there's strategies to make sure that Gov is actually the winnable position because, you have all of the decision-making power within CP if you're on Gov. So, you should be able to gain that to your favor. Cool. First of all, CP is not BP. I've never really talked to anybody here, well, I guess any of the non-old people here about my thoughts on how to prep BP. But in a BP round, if you draw OG, your only plan and your only goal should be to make sure that you have the greatest PM speech that you can, that sets up the debate very effectively, that chooses the best arguments and weighs them substantially. And for the DPM speech, you're just kind of chilling until you hear the first opposition speaker speak. Maybe at best, you have a general idea of what they might say and you prepare some general responses to it or think about it a little bit. But in general, in BP debates, you're trying to make sure that the PM speaker is as good as possible because you have less control over the debate in a BP round, that you want to make sure that the PM can really, really try to take more of that control. In a CP round, you have a lot of options. And the key thing we're going to be talking about here is that one of the primary things in CP debating that you should be doing is actually prioritizing making sure that the DPM speech is as effective as possible before the round, and that the PM speech is not as necessary as a result, or should be planned around a lot of the stuff you expect to happen in the DPM. So let's chat about that a little bit. Pathways. So generally speaking in debating, there are two types of debates. Lazily, I'm going to be stealing terminology from another debater, but type A and type B. Type A type of debates are ones where you have about 6 to 9 arguments that exist rather regularly on both sides of the house, where both sides have a lot of different arguments that are quite broad, quite vast. And as a result, the debate can go any number of directions, right? A very easy example of this would be a motion like this house regrets the trends towards globalization, where there are such a vast differing amounts of arguments and examples and context that type of debate can take place in, that it's difficult to say that this is a narrow debate that is easy to focus into being about one or two types of issues. The second type of debate, type B, is just the antithesis of this. It is a debate where it is quite narrow from the get-go, where both teams know exactly more or less what the other side is going to say, and that this is largely then a competition of who is able to better mechanize their side of it, or who has the better specific response to the argument that you can pre-prepare. So a very simple example of this would be a motion like, this house would ban violent video games, where, like, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, there are maybe one argument on each side, right? And there's not much more valuable other than that one argument on each side. In CP debating, as much as possible, you want to force op into being more or less a type B situation. You want to try to form your case in such a way that opposition thinks, due to not having all that much prep time, that there is only one reasonable line of argumentation for them to take. And you do this by, one, framing like crazy. What you want to be doing in your CP rounds is emphasizing what you think is important and explaining why those considerations are round winning. In a lot of CP debates that end up going less than fortunately for govs, are CP debates that turn into shootouts, right? Where there's 16 different arguments, 5 different clashes that, everybody has said something about. And it's one where it's rather difficult to assess, what was the most important issue in the debate. And the reason why is because at the end of the debate, in your little PMR speech at the end, you don't have that much time to now emphasize why clashes 1, 4, and 7 were more important than clashes 2, 3, 5, and 6, and why, because you're winning on those 3 clashes, you should then win over an op team who's winning on the 4 other clashes. You simply don't have enough time to be able to do that, right? And also, it means that you lose a lot of your strategic advantage of having the ability to pre-prepare a round if you run a round that's super broad and has like 8 different argument ideas for opposition, and they simply pick a new 9th argument that you hadn't really considered all that much. So now all of the rebuttal work that you had considered doing, or all of the framing work you had wanted to do and explain why this new issue was the most important thing, is now not really that important because they've now said something you completely didn't expect. What you want to be doing is you want to be, one, framing. So that way, as you're explaining why this idea of agency or effects on the economy or whatever is the most important consideration in the debate, and give a lot of weight to an argument about it early and often in the PM speech, you force op into taking a position that makes them think that that's the primary thing that they should talk about. Because given they don't have that much time to write notes, they don't have that much time to think of new arguments, their ability to write, hey, here's a completely independent argument, here's 3 reasons why it's important, here's why it's more important than theirs, here's all our mechanisms, is going to be quite difficult, right? If you can make it seem like you've done some of the work for them in explaining what a relevant argument is in this debate, you can now force them into taking a specific stance that now you know all the responses to and all the reasons why that argument is going to be insufficient, right? Weighing issues so you can win. Yeah, so the second point is more or less what I've said. Always frame around these issues. You want to try to force teams into a specific pathway. It's not just done by framing. It's also just done by like motion choices, right? If you want to set a motion about, this house believes that this house regrets Y narrative, right? That's a motion that can run into a lot of difficulties because, you can run into a narrative that affects multiple different groups in multiple different ways, in multiple different time periods, in multiple different countries, right? If you want to narrow it, you can simply change the motion to, this house believes that Y narrative has done more harm than good to people in X context, right? And as a result, you've narrowed the debate a bit more, chosen the battleground that you might find the more interesting one, the one you were going to talk about the most anyway, the one that you thought was the round winning one regardless. And because of this limitation, you now make it a bit easier for a bit harder for opposition teams to make new arguments outside of that paradigm, right? You want to constantly think about what the intuitive, obvious opposition case is as possible, so you can always make sure you have responses to it. Secondly, targeting. Be toxic, target people. Targeting is a strategy whereby you choose what type of case you are going to run based on who your opponent is. You look at your opponent and you go, yeah, I think you'd be bad at this. So you choose emotion precisely for that. People used to say that this was potentially a toxic trait in CP debating. I say become the Joker. Be your toxic self. And obviously, you don't know a lot of people within the circuit. You don't have as much experience. This is a potentially harder thing to be able to do. But what I want to emphasize is a few things. One, if you're not necessarily sure who the other side is or what their strengths are, don't make really bad guesses about this and run a case about something you don't know much about, but you think the other side doesn't know all that much about, and as a result both of you do poorly. Instead, if you're not necessarily sure how relatively strong your opponent is, make sure you're running a case that plays to your strengths. Always play to things that you probably know about more than other people, so that way, regardless of the relative skill level of the other side, you are always at a competitive advantage. You can take out teams who are in potentiality like categorically better than you if you simply are playing to your strengths and running motions about things you know a lot about that you can't be all that sure that other people would know about, right? So cool. Sorry, I saw a bunch of things in the chat. Yeah, but secondly, you can target generally. Like if you think that, hey, I've seen these two people in a debate once or twice, and both times they weren't really all that good at talking about women, run your radical feminist case on them. Make them uncomfortable. One of the primary strategies throughout all of CP debating history has been find the two white guys who went to a private school and make them talk about women. It has an insanely high success rate, let me tell you, and this is a potentially very useful thing the more you get familiar with other people in the circuit that is very much to your benefit, because a lot of people aren't going to go out of their way to read about issues that they're not very good at or that they're not interested in purely to be able to do better in CP debates. Anyway, on to the next. Prep responses. So I know I've talked about this a lot already, but I can't emphasize this enough. You want to know exactly what their weakness is in this argument, but you want to make sure. So there's something to note about the DPM speech here, right? After your speech, Op has 10 uninterrupted minutes to make more arguments. They're not going to use all constructive, but you can add a lot of material in that 10-minute block. I can teach a seminar in Texas. It's hilarious. Anyway, there's a lot of new material that opposition can say in the 10 minutes that they get uninterrupted. And because in CP debating, POIs are not particularly prominent and not particularly common, it is unlikely that you get much of a response until your PMR. And given you should have 4 minutes for your PMR, that's still not that much time to deal with a lot of issues. So when I say prep your responses, what I mean is one, word economy, right? Make sure that you're thinking of responses that are efficient and get to the point, right? Make sure that you're thinking of examples that are actually good, intuitive examples that don't require too much explaining, that disprove a lot of their arguments. If you need to come up with reasonable hypothetical situations, you can do that. But also you want to make sure that as you are giving responses, you are able to respond both on the flow, meaning your ability to it's not impacted, and you just explain that effectively, while simultaneously explaining why your argument is strategically important. So explaining things like why comparatively your argument is better. Always emphasizing those comparative differences. Why it is that their arguments are non-unique, right? Because in many circumstances, op teams, because they're flailing around trying to think of anything that might constitute an argument, might make an argument that is just completely non-unique and non-exclusive. Point that out. It's to your benefit, right? Making sure that you're constantly layering in these strategic things into your speeches might be very useful for a lot of the response material that you're going to be doing in this. Your most important thing in the second speech here is to make sure that you have a high level response to a lot of the ideas the other side has said in their 7-minute speech, because you want to make that 10-minute block work for the rest of the debate. You want to make them think that, like, okay, they have a good response to every one of our arguments, so I actually now need to rebuild the entirety of the LO speech before I can even give rebuttal, right? And make it such that they feel that make it such that it's more likely that they forget a response, forget to rebuild something, don't make a particularly good response because they're rushing. And you can only do this by doing a lot of this prep work and by making sure that you're able to be as efficient as possible when doing this. I don't have a slide for this next bit because I realized I kind of forgot to, if we're being honest, but we haven't really talked about the PM speech here. We've talked a lot about the second speech, and as I think you should, because I think you should be prepping your second speeches a lot and thinking a lot about what is the op case likely to be, how do we respond to it. But at this point, the main thing you want to be doing when it comes to prepping a PM speech there is, one, making sure that you know exactly how much time it takes you to give that PM speech. You don't have to go crazy with it as I would have done years ago and practice your PM speech 4 to 8 times before a tournament, making sure that you've written it in a way that you get exactly to 6 minutes and 15 seconds at the end of your last argument. And of potentially bad time management. If it happens, it happens. So yeah, making sure that a lot of instances of your casework, is able to get out within the allotted time. You're limiting on things like repetition, so that way, you can be more effective in your arguments and not, not waste time. As well, once you've identified what you think the most likely op case is going to be, build your PM speech around that. Like, if you think that the most likely op case is some nonsense about backlash or whatever, outline the positives of this and then just have a bit in your PM speech about why backlash would be unlikely or why it wouldn't be particularly useful, right? Or why it wouldn't lead anywhere. So that way, early in the debate, there's already something that's pushing up against the likely op line. You want to make sure that CP debating is as responsive as possible and as preemptive as possible for you to be able to do well. Cool. Moving on. Op strategy. As mentioned earlier, if you draw op, you have about a 60% chance of winning. However, most people who are new to CP are very scared of op because you don't have that much time. So we're going to be learning how to do op. Reminder, gov teams are stupid. All of them, always. Every gov team you have ever gone against is a dirty liar. You want to keep this in your head. Why? Because as we've been talking about for the entirety of our presentation at this point, gov teams are trying to bait you. Gov teams, if they're doing their job well, want you to trip up and fall for whatever trap they have lying ahead in their case. And they want you to fall for it so that way they can kick you exactly where it is that they expected you to come from argumentatively. So there are many things strategically that work a lot to your benefit on opposition that would never, ever, 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 ever work in a BP context that is worth doing in CP. The first is being super nitpicky, super nitpicky in op cases. What do I mean by this? In BP debate, if you started basically saying, oh, it was unclear if the policy would work in X way or in Y way, so we're going to choose the potentially uncharitable Y way that this terrible policy, this policy would be implemented, and explain why it is that that version of the policy would be very bad. Or, oh, they didn't explain whether or not this policy would be free and accessible to people, so maybe it wouldn't, because businesses would never actually allow that to be the case, and governments like to privatize things. So any benefit that they want really only ever happens for rich people. Now they are crowding out poor people or forcing them into poor that type of stuff. In a BP debate, you could never do this, right? In a BP debate, if you spent as much time attacking the way that they set up the debate, you would not do well. But in CP, if another team is implementing a policy, right? If you're getting a motion, and I'm sorry if they are currently here, but I'm going to be using a motion that a team of ours dropped to the previous weekend. But if a team comes at you with a case about like China pivoting towards infrastructural developments domestically, as opposed to continuing the Belt and Road Initiative, like a very quick way to be able to engage in this case is like, all right, if they're talking about doing this immediately, right, and a pretty quick transition away, I'm sorry, why is it in China's interest to have a multi-trillion-dollar project killed when there are, thousands of people who are employed by it, as well as a bunch of infrastructural development that has already began that is now going to sit there and go to waste? Like, why would you ever bother doing this now as opposed to later, right? Or, why would you ever prioritize doing infrastructural development if there's already some happening currently? You haven't really explained why we need such a drastic change towards it if there are XYZ other ways that we could get it. All of that type of stuff is quite relevant to a CP debate, because if Gov is trying to paint a picture of why their specific policy is going to be a good thing, if you can just like pick holes at a lot of like the bad implementation stuff that they just like skipped over because they got overexcited about it, you're going to be to your benefit. But Gov teams are often going to like try to dance around this and like not really explain their model or say, oh, we don't want a debate about the model because that's boring. That's because they know they don't have a good one in most cases, and therefore they don't want to talk about it. Secondly, don't buy into their framing. In a lot of instances, if a Gov team says, this is a debate purely about issue X, no, it's not. It almost certainly is not exclusively about that. But what they're trying to do is, say, hey, here's how we would win the debate. So as a result, we're going to talk about this. And they're hoping on you intuitively saying, well, we're not going to let you win the debate on this and have it be a whole debate about that one issue. You can very easily just say, no, that's not what this debate should be about. It should be about, and you can be broad with this. You can say, if they stand up and say, hey, we think that this is a debate exclusively about how it is that we ensure that there's more upward mobility for poor people. You can say, no, that's not a debate exclusively about that. We agree it's a relevant component of the debate, but insofar as we could generally show that there are more harms than goods from this policy, we would still be able to take the debate, right? You can be broad with it, but make sure that if they try to narrow the debate into being about one issue, you work towards expanding it again, so that way you can be good. Here's the big one. In BP debating, your LO speeches are pretty rudimentary, right? Not in a bad way, but in the sense that stylistically, it's some rebuttal to the prime minister speaker, 2 to 4 constructive arguments for your side, and that's about it. In CP, this is not always to your benefit. Why? Because you are at an inherent disadvantage on op, which is you learned the motion a minute and a half ago, and you have 5 more minutes until you speak. It is going to be difficult for you to, set up 2 to 4 independent arguments in a very clean and structured way, and write out all your mechanisms for all of them so that you're as structured as their side. You don't have to behave that way on first op in CP debating. What you can do is, and I've said, give them the razzle dazzle because I think I'm funny. But basically speaking, if you have like 6 to 10 argument fragments, you know that they're not full, independent, fully mechanized arguments that you would run in a BP debate. But it's 6 to 10 things that like are probably true about their motion and are probably concerns or harms that would likely come into existence. Say all of them, even if it only takes you like 45 seconds to get through them. You're very possible on opposition to do quite well in a case where you go, okay, issue 1, I think that this is likely to happen. I think that this is likely to happen for this reason, and it would be bad for this reason. Okay, there's also this concern, and you can do it in a rather sporadic context as long as you're good at signposting along the way when you're moving into new issues. What this basically is that you can just throw paint at the wall and see, and see what sticks, right? Because given that Gov only has 7 minutes to be able to actually build their case and defend it for the last time before you get an uninterrupted 10-minute speaking block, if you throw 6 to 8 argument ideas out there, all of which are somewhat analyzed enough to have some level of weight behind them. What you've now done is you force the DPM speaker to have responses to all of it. Because if they don't respond to one of your arguments, if it's now made a much stronger argument in the second speech, they're definitely losing on that clash. And now that they have to respond to 6 to 7 arguments, they now all of a sudden don't have enough time to add more weighing to their case, to add more rebuilding and more analysis to their case. So what you want to be able to do is, if you can throw a bunch of ideas out there that are reasonably analyzed and are genuinely relevant concerns, like don't do this for stupid ideas, like don't do this for arguments that are clearly nonsense you would never try to actually develop. But for concerns that like you have some intuition are pretty relevant and are pretty important in the debate, but you don't know all of the analysis to back it up, throw it out there, make them engage with it, make them have to make a decision, make them pivot to something. If they have to make more decisions, the likelihood they make an absolute catastrophic error is quite high. And the reason why you want to do this is not just for the reasons stated, but it means that now your second speaker, that they've had a bit more time to decompress what the motion is, think about it in a bit more depth, can now use their time to build a lot of new analysis under this issue and just frame it as rebuttal or frame it as rebuilding. And they can use that very heavily to their advantage in their speech. That, hey, here's 2 arguments they didn't respond to. Hey, we made this argument. I'm going to add 2 pieces of analysis to make it even stronger. But, they only gave you a 1-word response to it. So we're probably going to beat them on that clash. It means that you have a lot of breadth to the debate and a lot more different fronts that you're forcing them to engage the debate on. That means that you have an easier edge to be able to beat them out on. So, at every pro, take the 10-minute speech, so help you God. I'm going to now make a very impassioned argument in favor of the 10-minute speech. For all of you who I know are, sorry, my feeder's on somewhat low battery, so I'm gonna go plug it in. For all of you who I know are relatively experienced debaters who have been doing this for quite a few years, have a decent amount of open breaks, this is a message for you, as well as for those of you who debated, regularly throughout high school, who I also know are able to speak for 10 minutes continuously and still have new material to say. Do the 10-minute speech. Do it every time. Why? Because first, I have never in my life, and I've been doing CP debating for now 6 years, never in my life have I seen a 3-minute LOR speech have any influence on whether or not GovOp wins. Never, ever, ever in my life has that 3-minute LOR made a difference in my deliberation. Not once, ever in my life. And the reason for this is simple, because you now had a 7-minute speaker who was picking up momentum, who was in their groove, completely brought to a stop, so that way the LOR can stand up and, they spend 35 seconds on an introduction, an extra 20 seconds on signposting throughout. Realistically, there's maybe only 2 minutes of content that can be said in this, but if you're trying to organize it as a 3-minute whip speech, you just don't have the time to do the weighings necessary to do this effectively. But what you can do, if you take it as a 10-minute speech, is treat it as a 10-minute long whip speech. Rather than having to do a 3-minute mini whip at the end, you can set up your entire speech as, okay, we're going to talk about 3 issues in this debate. First, there are arguments on this. Second, our arguments on that. And third, general weighing in the round and how we should approach understanding this debate. And it means that you have a lot of time to, specifically target issues in the debate that they previously didn't explain that much, or that, in other 7-minute speeches, you probably wouldn't have addressed, but now you can because it's a 10-minute speech. You can do 3 minutes of framing at the top of your LO speech that's 10 minutes long and still have the length of an entire normal speech afterwards. The amount of flexibility that this gives you and the amount of material you can add purely through rebuttal and through framing and through reframing and rebuilding is massive. And the likelihood that you ever get called out for this being a dump or whatever is low, as long as you are constantly referencing analysis that their side mentioned in their case and explaining why what you are contributing simply should be understood as rebuttal to it, or simply should be understood as reasons why the argument your partner made are still true and relevant, right? If you're constantly framing your issues like this, your 10-minute speech gives you such an unparalleled amount of time to make the debate about whatever core issue you know you can win on, and now force the TMR speech to engage with all of the mastodon of stuff you've just said in this speech, whether it be by any new framing that you add, any new weighing that you add. And because you get to do so much work against the core issue of the case, their side is unlikely to be all that prepared to be able to engage with it in such a short amount of time at the end of the debate. So if you are comfortable doing the 10-minute speech, do it. It is so much more to your advantage than the LOR ever could be. You get so much more freedom, more opportunity to say new things. You have more opportunity to engage with ideas that neither speech would have otherwise. It's just the more worthwhile speech to do. Cool. Moving on to the next bit, and then we'll be done. Making tight calls. This is a very short one. There are arguments. If any of you ever make a tight call and say, well, this is tight because we have to support X, and that thing is a bad thing, so this is tight, you will not win it. I'm confident you will not win your tight call. At its core, tight calls are arguments. You are saying that because their case is so intuitively strong that there is no good reason to not do this, our arguments cannot possibly beat theirs. Therefore, due to the unfairness at the core of this case, you should then not allow them to win for doing so, and our argument should be seen as more important. What this means is you need to build it out. There are a number of different reasons why a case might be considered tight. The first is because the case itself is simply inherently tight. A motion as simple, like this would never happen, but it's just to draw out the example. Like a motion like this House would legalize gay marriage is tight because there is no argument that isn't offensive and homophobic on op. There are other arguments that are reasonably similar, like other motions that are reasonably similar in terms of their tightness, where it's just like there is no arguments other than bigotry on opposition or other than just like dehumanizing people. These aren't the most common though. What I would say are the most common are cases that are tight because they either are taking on a very low burden or are expecting entirely too much out of op. What I mean by cases that are taking on entirely too much of a low burden are under two categories. The first are cases that take on a low burden because they're not asking to change much about the status quo. They want to implement a very minor change to how the world works. Yeah, okay, so this House regrets productivity culture, and Gov stands up and says, by productivity culture, we mean people working more than they ever should and feeling tired and upset about it. I'm still personally not fully sure that that's tight, but that definitely seems like a way that they ran it that makes it a lot more tight than my intuition probably leads me to believe. But yeah, you know, when it comes to low burdens, it's things like Gov supporting a policy that is so marginal in the amount of effect that it's ever going to have in society that it's difficult to say that you'll ever have, you know, a harm coming out of it. You know, I remember there was a round last year where a team ran a motion to the effect of, you know, this House believes that doctors should have to take empathy tests in order to, you know, have their license. And it's like, okay, like, sure, we ended up winning on op both on the flow and on the tight call. But, you know, it's such a minor change to society that doctors have to, you know, prove that they're somewhat empathetic towards their patients, that it's difficult to say that there's a substantially big harm that could come about to society due to such a minor inconsequential change. As well, you know, there's other versions of this where a team runs a case that is not tight due to the wording of the motion, but is tight due to how they run the motion. So an example of this would be this House would legalize polygamy. Whether or not this case is tight just by the wording of the motion, debatable. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, not really the subject of this. But the questions team on government decided to run an argument that was the entirety of their case, which was the reason why we should legalize polygamy is because under both sides of the House, it's going to happen. So For the women who are in abusive situations in polygamous relationships, they should feel more comfortable talking to authorities about the nature of their relationship and therefore go to the hospital or go to the police if they so find it necessary to do so. And because it is better that these women get the help that they need from the authorities than not get the help from authorities that they need, we then win this debate. This case is tight because literally what they were asking us to do in opposition was demonstrate why women shouldn't get help from hospitals or, police, police if they need it, right? At best we could argue that legalization wouldn't make things better, but like it really is difficult to say that, if that's the key argument that they're making in the debate, that there is any sort of meaningful response to it or, meaningful way to say that that wouldn't technically be true, that it becomes a tight case as a result. But you want to be able to make the arguments. You have to be able to demonstrate, look, they want us to support X principle. Here's why X principle or X practical outcome could not be considered as more important than their principle or practical outcome. So given that there is no meaningful way for us to beat them, there is not much of an opportunity for us to have a meaningful debate. And from there, you have to play ball, right? From there, once you make the tight call, you have to make as many arguments as you can within the motion to try to win it anyway, because you don't just get to end your speech immediately afterwards. But you really need to flesh it out. You need to give a thorough justification for why it is that the motion is tight before you can get as much credit as otherwise you would want. Wonderful. Any questions?
I had one. Generally speaking, if someone tight calls you